Chapter 13. Lady Ferranda Vilazar, wide awake and miffed at rats invading her camp, pointed her pistol at him. Though she must be a decent shot, Tristan was more worried by Sonali carefully aiming his long-barreled musket. Mulaney had a reputation for being good shots, and the same was true of Huntsman, a man who was not to be trifled with. Pressing his knife tighter against Lan's throat, he forced her to stand between him and the threats. "Muzzles down," Tristan ordered, "or I slit her throat." Ferranda, seemingly more at ease in hunting leathers than she had ever been on the Blue Belt, laughed in his face. "Go ahead," the Infanzon said. "She's not one of ours." "That's unfortunate," Tristan admitted. "Right?" Lam complained. "And here I'd thought we were getting along." The surviving twin had yet to even struggle against his grasp, not seeming terribly concerned with being his hostage. "This doesn't need to turn violent," Saray called out. "We didn't come here to fight." He noted with approval that she still moved to get part of Lan in between her and the potential shots. "Walk away," Sonali replied, "and there will be no fight." The tall Mulaney had not moved an inch since shouldering his musket, barely even blinking, but Tristan could not afford to keep his eyes on him. Ferranda was beginning to slowly inch left, towards a better angle of fire. "We can't do that," Tristan said. He took a half step back, moving to keep Lan in the way of both Ferranda and Sonali, and the Infanzona stopped trying to flank him. "For now. As a neutral and unconcerned party," Lan opined, "I believe we should come to a peaceful resolution." She was unanimously ignored. "We found this place first," Ferranda told him. "By right it is ours to use." "The temple upstairs isn't fit for sleeping," Tristan replied. "The stink is unbearable and there's no door to keep creatures out. If the choice is between you and crocodiles in my bedroll, I'll take my chances here." He meant it too. It might be best to feign backing down first so they could come back in a while with more muscle, but the thief would not risk sleeping upstairs. Ferranda hesitated, which was unflattering to her stout face. She looked like she was biting down on the twig. She then shared a long look with her hired hand, who eventually nodded. "We still have first claim," Ferranda said. "If you want to use this place, your group will have to pay in supplies." "Group?" she had said, which meant she knew it was not only he and Saray. Tristan spared a moment to glare at a cheerfully unrepentant Lan. She had wasted no time in selling information on them all. "I even gave them my best guess about your contract for free," she smilingly whispered. "Because fuck you, Tristan. Did you think I'd let you threaten me without paying for it?" "That's fair," the thief conceded. He was not offended by the sale on moral grounds, only irritated by the inconvenience of it. "Do we have a bargain, Tristan?" Ferranda Vilazar pressed. He was still hesitating when Saray brushed past him, coming fully into the fire's light and exaggeratedly putting away her knife. "In principle we agree," she said. "Now let us talk specifics." Ferranda's face tightened at the sight of the pale skin, and Sonali moved his muzzle to aim at her without even realizing it, but when Tristan released his still smiling Lan, the tension released. "You heard her," Tristan said. "Let's haggle. A day's worth of rations each, cut in half for all those who would keep watch," which was, in practice, all of them. That was how much they'd pay. Saray also got the pair to agree that their company could earn back more of the fee through chores, tending the fire, cooking, mending and washing clothes. There was some discontent among their group at the prospect of playing servants to the pair when they outnumbered them so, but sheer exhaustion saw to it no one refused the terms. Some among them might have accepted cutting off a finger for a good night's sleep in a safe place. The shrine itself was much too small to accommodate everyone. Counting Ferranda and a huntsman, they now numbered 10, so most of them ended up spreading their bedroll right outside it. A round of introductions began, then was aborted halfway through when it came out Lan was also here, few taking the revelation of her presence well. By the time tempers had cooled, no one was in a mood for talk, so instead they went to sleep. It was much refreshed that Tristan woke up that afternoon, most the others still sleeping. Young was seated by the fire with Sonali, the two men talking in low voices as they gestured, and not far from them Vanessa was slowly and carefully plucking feathers off a freshly killed bird. 2 more were waiting. The thief watched the careful way she moved, realizing she was trying to learn how to compensate for her missing eye. With everyone else asleep, save for Lan and Feranda, who were missing, he decided he might as well help her. The discussion between the others seemed to involve to welcome a third. Wordlessly he picked up another of the bird, some gray feathered thing about the size of a duck, and got to plucking. Even missing an eye, Vanessa was going faster than him, which had her smiling. Practice, she excused him. She adjusted her glasses on her face, after Say was forever fiddling with them since the grave bird had ripped through glass and wire to get at her eye. The frame was bent and dug into the side of her head, but it was either that or not seeing much of anything. I don't eat a lot of bird, Tristan conceded. Pork was cheaper. You could feed a pig damn near anything and they were much harder to steal than chickens. There was a reason they were the staple meat of the Merc. They are one of the only things I can cook, Vanessa smiled. My mother despaired I avoided the kitchen, but at least I learned her almond sauce recipe before she passed. You worked, then, the thief said. I am a clockmaker, the old woman said, then grimaced and reached for the cloth covering her missing eye. Or I was, at least. I am not sure I could do detail work anymore. Ah, Tristan thought. And there was the mystery of how she had afforded her pocket watch and her glasses solved. Not only was clockmaking a lucrative trade, she worked with watches and lenses. A cobbler never went barefoot. It did not explain what a woman of her age and means was doing on the Dominion, but that mystery was being chipped away at slowly but surely. The thief decided to let the matter lie for now, as obtaining the story there was more a matter of curiosity than need, but Vanessa surprised. You must be wondering how I ended up here, the old woman knowingly said. The question has crossed my mind, Tristan admitted. You're such a polite boy, Vanessa chuckled, shaking her head. It is no great secret, I don't mind telling you. She plucked out another feather, dropping it to flutter. My son is in debt to the men Romano, Vanessa said. Enough he was never going to dig himself out, so they decided to send him here as payment. Only his leg was crippled, Tristan, so he was sure to die. The thief grimaced. This was an ugly story and he could already tell how it would end. I offered to go in his place, the old woman said. My husband is gone and tinkering no longer brings me the joy it used to. Better to spare my only son than spend my last years withering on the vine. He offered her a sad smile, at a loss of what to say. Was such a sacrifice to be praised? Tristan was not so sure. It was an act of love, but the man saved did not sound deserving of it. How long would it take before he frittered away his mother's sacrifice? You are kind, listening to me ramble like this, Vanessa said, patting his arm. Doing so much to keep us alive when some of us are so little help. She sighed tiredly, leaning back. Do not let the trials burn it out of you, she sleepily said. And Tristan felt a sliver of shame, because he was not kind at all. Even as she had talked, part of him had been more concerned with the puzzle than the woman. The same part that had noted the men Romano had sent in 2 souls this year, Ocotlan, that large Aslan, had been a leg breaker for them, and wondered if there was anything there he could use. They plucked the rest of the birds in silence, and when he left afterwards it felt a little like fleeing. By afternoon's end everyone was awake and the cave had turned bustling. Lanterns were fully unveiled as everyone busied themselves, clothes were washed and mended, wounds seen to, and there was haggling over the fresh meat and use of the fire for cooking. Their refuge had turned into a smallest of villages, a happy one now that everyone was rested and fed, but Tristan knew it would not last. Already Phyllis was growing prickly, though never when Yang and Sonali were looking, and Lan had somehow charmed Vanessa into speaking with her again. Tristan washed and mended his clothes, leaving them to dry as he sat in little more than a shirt and underclothes. The currents were plain to see. Ains was furious at her husband for the glances he kept throwing at Lan, who would no doubt fork over some dust by day's end to get a leash on the man again. Vanessa was too bloodied and exhausted to do much of anything, and whenever Francho wasn't coughing in the corner he was peering at the carvings to the left shrine entrance, which was irritating Phyllis, whose bedroll was near there. Feranda had begun speaking with a surprised Tsare, who warmed to her before long. Much as Tristan would have liked to eavesdrop on that conversation, he had thinking to do. They needed to cross the forest and bridge to get to the Trial of Ruins, and the obstacles in the way were greater than anticipated. His bet with the Red-Eye Warbands, that they would be split between the bridges and could be tricked through this, seemed to have paid off. It was the Heliodorn beast he had not counted on, and it made everything harder to predict. Men he could guess at, but beasts? He could not be sure when the monster would decide to wander off, what was keeping it here in the first place, and how the cultists would react to its presence. They were still around. Sonali had seen the Warbands searching the tall grass when he went out hunting, but the Milani could only speak to the surroundings of the temple. He had, wisely, not gone further than that. Meanwhile the bridge was in the woods, further north. Were there cultists there as well, or had the Heliodorn beast driven them all off? Would the Warbands and the grass immediately head for the bridge when the Lemure left? Were they already clearing out west towards the other bridge? Too many questions he did not have answers to. Instead of giving into frustration, he followed Abuela's lessons and instead attended to unknowns he could find the answer to. There was not mending his medicine cabinet, not with the tools on hand, but the thief said about taking inventory of what remained usable and fixing it up enough it wouldn't spill everything out. Tristan had already taken a first look when seeing the wounds earlier, but a closer look gave grim answers. Most of what he had left were poisons, which had been kept deepest in white arsenic, antimony, mandrake and Volcian yew. The lodestone extract remained, as did the bearded cat extracts. Neither were mortal, the bearded cat being a mushroom whose extract caused violent bursts of madness in those who partook of it. Aside from these, he only had the distilled alcohol and the medical turpentine he'd been using to treat his burns. There was only so much he might accomplish with these. Putting his entire supply of Volcian yew in a corpse might possibly inconvenience a beast the size of the Erevatin if it ate it. The substance was a poison meant for lemures and lars, but it would not kill it. None of his other poisons would affect it all that much. He was unsure if the lodestone extract would have any effect, since he could not recall seeing a nose on the lemure, and the creature was already blood-mad, so there was hardly a point to the bearded cat extract. He could spare neither the alcohol nor the turpentine. "You're pouting," Fortuna teased. So much activity in such close quarters had mercifully seen to it she did not need further entertainment. Being overly nosy tended to make up swaths of her day no matter where they were. "I am low on tools," Tristan murmured back. And thinking about this wrong, he realized as his eyes moved to the others in the cavern. He did not need to attract the Heliodorn beasts directly when he could rely on someone else doing so. Dosing Ferrand of Elazar with lodestone extract just before they parted ways was likely his best bet. Killing the other lemures the scent would attract at a decent choice of attracting the greater monster. Meanwhile their own group could make a run for the bridge and gamble on the cultists not having returned to hold it yet. The issue, he figured, was that Lan might have revealed he had pulled this very trick on the Infanzones already. If the pair were watching for it and caught him, the potential blowback could get him killed. He needed to have a talk with Lan. And not paying enough attention, Fortuna told him. "Sare's been whispering with that noble in a corner for half an hour now." And that, Tristan thought, might be a problem. When he turned to have a look at the two of them he found that Sare was rising to her feet. Her gaze swept the cavern, lingering on him, and his stomach dropped. He could see where this was headed already. His companion did not waste much time, sparing only an amused look for the way he was sitting on his knees in his underclothes. "We should talk," Sare told him. "Young too." Tristan nodded, telling her he wanted to dress first to buy himself some time. Yang had struck a quick friendship with Sonali, which was good for them but less so for Tristan. He could guess which way the Tianxi would be leaning in the conversation to come. The five of them squeezed in around the small fire, given the run of the shrine by the others. Lam's sly offer to tend the flames for them was politely refused, for at least a little while. "I have been speaking with Sare," Lady Ferranda said, "and it appears both our groups are intending to make for the Eastern Bridge." Their plans had hardly been a secret, and even if they had been, Lan would already have sold them. Tristan had anticipated that Firandovilazar would learn this, that much was no surprise. What he had not anticipated was that an Infanzona would deign to talk to a pale-skinned foreigner, getting a hook in one of the three people needing convincing before their groups could ally. It would only be sensible to attempt the crossing together, Sare said. Between the cultists and the Heliodorine beast, we need all the help we can get. Sonali met his employer's gaze for a moment, then turned and shrugged as agreement. A glance at Yang's face told Tristan that the Tianxi was about to agree. That may not be wise, he slid in before Yang could speak. A large group will make noise and draw attention. I hardly think, Firanda Riley said, that it will be us two making that noise. Yes, Tristan thought, but if you come with us I cannot use you as a distraction. His was a poor argument and he knew it, so he turned the talk around instead. It is true, the two of you would have a better chance of sneaking through alone, the thief said. Which has me wondering what you gain by joining us. If he could not defend, best to make the enemy do so instead. The Milani huntsman fixed him with a flat stare, his bead-covered coat open at the front. Blades and powder, Sonali bluntly replied. The thief almost grimaced. He'd lost that in a single exchange. Finesse could only get you so far against pure candor. Sare is right, Tristan, Yang cut in. We need the help. I want 2 more sword arms with us if we stumble into a war band. And with Yang finally coming down on the side of the alliance, it was finished. Tristan did not rule their company, and though he was one of its leading figures so were the other 2. If they agreed, there was little he could do except leave. Continuing to struggle would only lessen him in the eyes of the others, so it was best to capitulate and move on. At least he could try to wheedle information out of this. Then it is settled, the thief said, shrugging his shoulders. We make common cause to cross the bridge. Sare nodded at him, pleased, and Yang only looked amused he'd not agreed from the start. It was true that on the face of the alliance was a net benefit. Their group had numbers, but they needed fighters. Meanwhile the pair had fighters but needed numbers, enough that they could not simply be overwhelmed by the hollows if they were caught by a war band. It was all too pretty, ever a sign that the story was yet young. Tristan did not doubt for a moment that Firandovilazar would sacrifice them the moment it gained her an edge, but that was fine. He just had to do it to her first. In the spirit of friendship, Sare said, Lady Firanda has agreed to share information about the state of the trials for us. Ah, Tristan thought. So that was what she had bartered for when whispering with the Infanzona in a corner. We encountered Lady Inyani's company before they went to fight their way through the western bridge, Firanda told them. They had taken wounds and one of their number was lost. That was a surprise. Inyani had been a grizzled old killer, a veteran, and the rest of her crew well armed. 2 more millennia of wealthy birth, a pair of remind that it proved skillful and that bland Estland woman made for an impressive crew, perhaps the finest fighting force to emerge from those brought by the Blue Bell. That this was even doubt could be explained by 2 words, Angharade Trediger. Lemures? Tristan asked. Cultists, the Infanzona sullenly replied, shaking her head, but they did not strike alone. Tupac Sickle and his 3 lackeys were with them. A round of grimaces followed that. Lan's prediction that Tupac meant to hunt them proving true was grim news. Their group rushed straight down the road, Yang finally said. They must have been the easiest to find. The blonde noble shook her head. That had been my guess as well, but Lady Inyani is no fool. They took a detour west to shake pursuers, Firanda said. It was on their way back to the road that they were attacked. Tristan frowned. Then how did the cultists find them? He asked. It would have been open ground Inyani's traveled, but though darklings could see better in the dark, and some colors were known only to their kind, their sight was not perfect. A small group taking an indirect route would not have been easy to find. A tracking contract, Sonali said. Was that a sliver of disdain in the huntsman's voice? Professional pride from a tracker, perhaps. It belongs to Lady Acanthifos, the pockmarked girl from Asphodel, Firanda continued. Lady Inyani's nephew learned this through his own contract, but with Lan's help I believe we learned how her contract functions. Tristan had been given the same information they had and found it was not much of a leap to make. "Ash and bone," he said. "Perhaps all human remains? A Kainthi can track them once she has touched them, or something close to that." Firanda nodded. "I imagine they intrigued to plant ash on all of the groups," she said. "I am surprised yours was not attacked. As was he, since theirs was the most vulnerable by far. Tupac would not have been able to hit them immediately. He would need to first find the Red Eye cult and strike his bargain, but once he had, they would have been the natural target. Their crew had been behind Inyani's, which had been the first to leave, and high in numbers while low on fighters. Perfect fodder for sacrifice. So why had Tupac not focused his efforts on them? Perhaps he had not been able to. Almost none of them had stood anywhere near Kainthi foes, Tristan noted as he tried to recall the early days of the trial. And almost all of them had a single bag and bedroll. It would have been harder to hide a piece of bone there than within the bags of larger groups. As for Ash, it occurred to Tristan, then, that he had passed some time working beside the Kainthi foes and she had even once taken his arm. "There was some kind of dust on the back of my sleeve," the thief suddenly remembered. Vanessa had thought it dust and soot when she cleaned his coat, but the lighting had been poor. It might well have been ash. The older woman had rid his arm of it quite thoroughly, though, and with a shiver the thief realized that Vanessa's small act of motherly kindness might just have saved all their lives. "We must," he forced out, "have gotten lucky." Firanda's brow rose. "The minis were with you, then?" Not eager to linger on how close they might just have come to getting killed, Tristan cleared his throat. "Who was it that Inyani's crew lost, if I may ask?" he asked. "Her nephew's lover, the girl called Ayanda," the Infanzona said. He was quite distraught over the loss. That the two younger Milani had been lovers was not something he had known, but neither was it a surprise. She had obviously not been kin to them, and there were only so many other things she could be. "They were lucky only one died," Tristan said. Therefore Firanda scowled. "We do not know for certain she is dead," the blonde said. "Lady Inyani said that Hollows were careful to take her alive." "The watch warned us," Sonali evenly said. "They want sacrifices." Better she had died, Tristan thought, than whatever the cult of the Red Eye had in store for her. Poor girl. Young, though sympathetic, kept the conversation moving. "Do you know if they crossed the bridge successfully?" he asked. "They did," Firanda said. "We held back and watched. Only there was trouble, they struck the cultists guarding it by surprise, but the fighting drew the Heliodorine beast." Tristan blinked. "Then they are all dead," he slowly said. "Before it could reach them, the beast fell into confusion," the Infanzona said. "The cultists scattered and frightened Lady Inyani's group fled north." Yang let out a low whistle. "That sounds," he said, "like a very dangerous contract. Do you know whose?" Sonali shook his head. "We were far," he said. Tristan's interest, however, had been caught by another detail. "The beast," he said, "did it seem lethargic? Was this the contract that had been used on him when an attempt was made to frame him for Jun's murder?" The Infanzona shrugged. "As Sonali said," she replied, "we were far. I can only tell you that when it came out of the daze and found no one around, it fell into a great rage." The noblewoman leaned forward. "And as it rampaged, it shook the earth so strongly that the bridge collapsed," Firanda said. Fuck, Tristan thought. The bet he'd thought had come true had, in a way, in reverse. Instead of the absence of people trying to cross the eastern bridge driving the Hollow there to head west, it would be the other way around. All the warbands that had been prowling around the western bridge would be headed this way even as they spoke. Fuck, he thought again. No wonder Belazar had been so eager to make an alliance with them even when she had evidently split from the rest of the Infanzones. The Infanzoni knew she needed to cross as soon as possible. The longer they waited, the more cultists would arrive. Turning on the pair was no longer feasible, he decided. He must act accordingly. When the beast wandered off, he said, "Did it appear to be tracking the cultists who fled?" Firanda Belazar narrowed her eyes at him. "It moved in the same direction as one of their groups," she acknowledged, then her face hardened. "Are you perhaps thinking of using lodestone extract?" There was a flat, accusatory note at the end. Solan had talked. Firanda's displeasure was understandable. She had been among those his ploy was to burn, or perhaps even had burned. Regardless, Tristan met her brown eyes without shame. "There is nothing to fear from me this time, Velazar," he replied. "You are no longer attempting to use us as bait." He had acted out of vengeance, it was true, but also out of practicality. The Infanzona's lips thinned in anger, but she did not argue the point. They had owed each other nothing, and it was not her the trick had been aimed at. Young's back had gone straight and his own gaze at the noblewoman was unimpressed, so Tristan was not without support. "Ervatency outdoors," Sonali brusquely said. It could work. Tristan's eyes swiveled to the hunter. "Lodestone extract smells like blood to Lemures, but it is not actually blood," he carefully said. "Would that still fool it?" The huntsman hesitated, then nodded. Tristan would have preferred greater certainty, but sensed it was the best he would get. "Then we might be able to distract it," the thief said. "It may chase us from there," Firanda warned. "Better to have it somewhere we know than to be left wondering where it is," Young replied. "We could try to attract it near the cultists," Sare said. "It would keep them both occupied while we make for the bridge." The thief blinked at her. That was bold, to say the least. He passed his hand through his hair, considering it just as the others were. "It would be playing with fire," Tristan finally said. "If they catch us planting the extract, if we get bogged down fighting them." None of them had forgot the massacre of the entire first wave of trial takers in exactly such a situation. Or that Inyani and her crew might well have suffered the same fate if they'd not had a contract that let them escape. "We would need to find a red-eye encampment for that plan to be an option at all," Young pragmatically said. "That means going out to look. We need to do that regardless," Firanda pointed out. "We cannot afford to rush in blindly, not with the forces arrayed against us." She was right, Tristan thought, and it was plain enough to see that no one argued. The talk instead turned to who would be going. Young volunteered, brushing aside the thief's worries about how his shoulder was healing. The wound had not torn muscle or required stitches. The great bird had been toying with him, so the Tianxi insisted he was fine. Firanda conferred with Sonali away from the fire, which surprised Tristan. It implied their relation was more nuanced than that of an Infanzona and her hired hand. "I will be going," Firanda said when they returned. "Two of us will be enough, any more and the chances of getting caught by a war band grow too high." And aside from Sonali, Tristan thought, no one else among them was practiced at forestry. He was decent at sneaking around, but even tall grass such as the one around the swamp was uncomfortably different from the alleys and rooftops of Sacramonte. It was agreed on without quibbling. The dangers headed their way, cooling any desire for argument, and after that all that they broke the news to the rest of their company. If Young and Lady Firanda came back with the right news, then they would be attempting the crossing tonight. Everyone began to pack the moment the pair disappeared into the passage. The mood was subdued, even Felix keeping his peace. Though from the suddenly loose shoulders on the men, Tristan figured that might have something to do with licking up some dust. The thief wondered what it was that Lan had demanded of him in exchange. As for the Mengxiao feint dealer, his idle suggestion that she be left behind had been refused. She had, it seemed, bought Lady Firanda's agreement to let her follow them until the second trial with information after stumbling onto the pair by pure chance. Tristan would not call a woman who'd lost a sister only days ago lucky, but the gods must have taken a shine to Lan for her to make it that far. That, or she had been sitting quiet on a contract. Just between them rats, he could admire how well she had played her rather lacking cards. Lan was a poor fighter, had displayed no contract and was openly unreliable in the face of danger. Yet with only wits and a penchant for digging into other people's things, she had been able to bargain her way to safety again and again. That was something worthy of respect, even if he did not particularly like the woman. Respect and some wariness, neither were the kind of people to hold a grudge over the kind of clawing they'd done at one another, but it would not do to forget that they were far from friendly. About a quarter hour into packing his belongings, Sare came to find him. It was idle chatter at first, but he noticed she was keeping an eye on how close other people were. As soon as she was sure no one could overhear, the talk changed. "You meant to use the lodestone trick again," Sarai quietly said. Them. "It's why you were against us allying." It was tempting to lie, but he bit down on the instinct. He had already extended trust. He would not keep doing so blindly, but withdrawing it just as blindly would be equally foolish. "It struck me as the most likely plan to work," Tristan said. It was a wash the moment they got land to talk, she replied, shaking her head. The dark-haired woman looked uncomfortable. "I thought your enmity was with the Cherden," she continued. "Not all in fan zones." The thief hesitated again, but he could see what silence would cost him here. No one wanted an ally that was a rabbit hound, which murderous hatred of all the nobles of Sacromonte might as well make him. "It is Cosmo Flora I most want dead," he admitted. "The brothers are ledger work, payment against an old debt." "And Fernando Vilazar?" Sarai pressed. "I have little against her," he shrugged. "I believed the pair would go their own way, which made them a sensible target." "You still opposed the alliance when I was bringing it forward," she pointed out. "And I still would, had I not learned of the other bridges breaking," Tristan frankly replied. "People will die in this crossing, Sarai. If I have a choice, I would rather it be them than us." All the Red Eye Warbans rushing their way tilted the odds against anyone being able to sneak through, enough so that additional swords were worth more than a distraction. If the pair could be used for their blades and other dupes used as a distraction, Sarai's suggestion, then that plan was superior. But it was also only viable now that they had skilled trackers other than Young out trying to find Darkling encampments. Sending out alone a wounded Young, who even in such a state was their best fighter, would have been rolling on bad odds. Sending a potential liability with him would have been even worse. Sarai's blue eyes stayed on him, then she slowly nodded. "Good," she said. "Worth staying allied with," she meant. He would not say he was relieved, but neither would he deny it. "Fernanda parted ways with the other nobles before your lodestone trick had effect," Sarai said. "Their plan was to climb the high road using a contract and then march across the island unhindered, but there is no telling if Lemures attacked them first." Tristan almost cursed. Of course the Infan zones had come in with a cushy plan that put them right out of harm's way while everyone else died beneath them. Lodestone extract would largely stop smelling after a day, so if they had made it up on the aqueduct they would be safe by now. There would be no telling until the second trial, then. And there I will have to act, or they will be able to slip away before the third. "One more reason to make it to the Trial of Ruins," he simply replied. He made sure to incline his head in thanks, acknowledging that she had most likely looked into the fate of the Cheridans for him. She smiled back, flicking his shoulder. "Mayhaps we'll be lucky and they'll have eaten at least 1 out of 3, she said. The thief smiled back, almost wonderingly. Not so much at the thought as how she had said it, "We'll get lucky." Not only him. The implicit promise there, without her having ever asked why he wanted any of them dead, was measure for measure. That was how Sarai dealt. He had told her the truth of what he wanted, so she had offered her help in achieving it. There was something so terrifyingly straightforward about that he ended up shying away from meeting her eyes. She had an ulterior purpose in these trials, he reminded himself, had admitted as much. It would be dangerous to begin trusting her too much. Sensing the mood had changed, Sarai took her leave. It left Tristan to finish packing his bag and rearranging the broken cabinet so that nothing would come out spilling where it dropped. Left him alone with his thoughts, also, or more accurately his thoughts and one more thing. She would make a good priestess, I think, Fortuna mused. You must ask her if she gambles. The goddess was sprawled theatrically across a flat stone, red dress flowing down artfully as she rested her chin against her palm. She was the very picture of imperial leisure, missing only servants to fan her and feed her grapes. Of course, he lied. Golden eyes narrowed at him. Are you pouting again? The goddess asked. You know, it is only charming if done once in a while. Otherwise is the province of toddlers. He rolled his eyes at her. It is only unease, not pouting, Tristan said. I feel. Fortuna snorted. "I knew you'd get like this about someone actually liking you," she smugly said. "It's all the amusement you refuse me when you get stab wounds." Tristan made sure no one was looking his way before glaring at her. "You're inventing things," he insisted. "This has nothing to do with Sare." "I never said her name," Fortuna smirked. "It was implied, you pile of bad decisions," he hissed back. "It's this plan, Fortuna, it is all wrong." The goddess gracefully shifted into a sitting position, legs over the edge of the stone, and her mood turned serious so swiftly he had no idea if she had been faking the taunting before it. Gods, she had always been like this. Sometimes she made him feel like he was still a boy. "What about it rubs you wrong?" she asked. Having to answer her forced him to think it out, to truly look at what it was that bothered him. "It is not the kind of method I like using," Tristan finally said. "It is barely a plan. It relies on assumptions. Even if it works perfectly it will be risky, and we are making too little use of the time we have before it begins." The last, he thought, might be the one that most went against the grain. Thievery was about waiting for the right moment, but the moment had to be found. It was not an orange falling into your lap. Too much was being left to chance, and too little done to change this. "Then do something about it," Fortuna shrugged, languidly rising to her feet. The dress followed, a trail of blood slinking after the goddess. She smirked at him again, strolling away like there was nothing more than say. The part he might be most resentful about, Tristan admitted to himself, was that she had helped. There were still hours left before they moved out, if they made the attempt tonight, and he did not have spent them sitting by his broken cabinet and silently fretting. So what could he do? His eyes swept across the cavern, lingering on the rest of the company before dismissing them. It would not be impossible to pull tricks to tighten or loosen alliances. Len and Felis were easy levers, but there would be no point. All of them wanted to survive. It would keep them together and looking outwards until there was a semblance of safety. Their remaining supplies were food, water, powder and bedrolls, none of which could be put to particularly unusual use. His gaze stopped on the carved doorway of the shrine, the great chain of silhouettes grasping the feet of those in front of them. Tristan was, at the end of the day, a thief. Why was he trying to be a general or a conspirator? Better that he use the skills he had actually learned. First, to case the place. Whoever had built this was long dead and buried. That was not the end of it. It so happened that Tristan had someone on hand who could get answers from beyond the grave. "It might be as old as the First Empire," Francio said, stroking his white stubble. "Not of antediluvian make, of course, it is much too humble for that, but still built before the old night. If he let that beard grow, it would not be long before he had more hair on his chin than his head." "So what was it for?" Tristan asked. "To honor some god? Religion before the orthodoxy was very haphazard, as far as we can tell," the toothless old professor mused. "The Universalist creed from the Isles is probably closest to what it looked like. And that means," the gray-eyed man encouraged. Francio blinked. "Temples to a god were rare," he said. "They were more along the lines of designated sacred places, grounds where mortals and gods might meet and give each other gifts if it pleased them. So there might still be a gift left," Tristan said, "if it was hidden well enough. This shrine was abandoned centuries before Sacromonte was a fishing village, my boy," Francio gently said, fighting down his cough. "If there was ever anything here of worth, it is long gone." But the old man was thinking as a historian, and that was not the right way here. This was the dominion of lost things, not some glittering temple on the Tower Coast. The island had been full of hollows and worse ever since anyone could remember, and while the temple above had been looted, the shrine was much older. It had not been so well hidden the Darklings would not have looted it, but how hard had they really looked? It would have seemed a small and dingy place, compared to the great painted temple above. And this was not the kind of place treasure hunters would come to even if it had not been watch territory, which made it even more off-limits. "There can be no harm in looking," Tristan said. "Is there a part that would be more sacred than the rest?" Francio sighed. "The ceiling," the old man said. What scarce records we have of the era imply that in many parts of Vesper firmament was feared and worshipped in equal measure. Tristan thanked him, the professor visibly forcing himself not to roll his eyes out of exasperation. Only Sonali sat within the shrine, tending to the last of the fire, and he did not spare the thief more than a glance. The insides were as plain as the outside, for all that the clever stonework tried to hide it. The arches and columns that stood out of the wall slightly were pure affectation, no more useful a support than any other carving might have been, and they led up to a high curved ceiling that was just slightly too uneven to truly count as a dome. Up there were circular stripes of stone standing out, whatever had been displayed on them worn away or covered by the black taint of smoke. At the apex of the almost dome was a full circle of the same motif as the threshold, silhouettes grabbing the feet of others, and a hole in the stone the size of a man's head. It went up, like a pipe, and was the reason a fire could be lit in a place small as this shrine without choking everyone inside. On the ground there were 3 broken altars, or so he guessed. Most the stone was gone, likely stolen by hollows. What few pieces remained were being used by Firanda and her hired hand to dry their clothes. Lifting a shirt under Sonali's watchful gaze revealed that their stone was covered with carvings. Still the silhouettes. "What are you doing?" Sonali asked. The man was looking at him with a frown. "Looting the shrine," Tristan frankly replied. The huntsman considered that, then nodded. "Good luck." The thief grinned back, then let his gaze drift back up. Franco had said the ceiling would be important, but even without the old man Tristan would have begun with looking there. It would have been the most difficult part of this shrine to make, and in the builder's place he would have been certain to add in a secret alcove or two. Climbing wasn't difficult beyond the strain it put on his burns, which was enough for the thief to be swallowing a hiss. Anchoring his foot against the side of the column, he hoisted himself up to have a look at the first stone stripe jutting out of the ceiling. It was, he found with surprise, also adorned with the silhouette chain. Only the top of the stripe, so it could not be seen from below, but the motif seemed to be circling around the near-dome ceiling. Ignoring Sonali's gaze, and now the people crowding the shrine entrance looking at him, the thief dragged his left foot up on top of one of the sculpted arcs and used the leverage to pull himself further up. From there he had a better vantage of the stripes, which he saw were all carved with the chain in the same place. And there was a detail to it. The way the chain was facing, it seemed to be encircling the ceiling through the stripes, circling upwards like a spring. "Franco," he called out. The old man brushed past Lan to come into the shrine, looking as if he did not know whether to be impressed or appalled. "You were going to break a leg for the grand prize of dust," the professor told him. The thief ignored that with the practiced ease of a man living bound to a goddess that could not be silenced. "There's a pattern to it," he said. "I need you to look at the carvings outside, around the door. Is there a beginning and an end to the chain?" Franco sighed but did look intrigued. More importantly, he inspected the carvings as he'd been asked, returning with surprise on his face. "There is both," he said. "And the end sneaks past the top of the threshold as a small line, continuing inside as a carving behind a ridge." "Where does it lead?" Tristan asked. His arms were beginning to cramp but he held himself tight. "The floor, and then nowhere," the old man said. "It is still a dead end. Now, maybe, but had it always been? The tiles in the temple upstairs had been ripped off the floor and walls, so it might well have been the same down here. A part of the chain was gone, but perhaps not all of it." "The altars," Tristan said. "They have markings too, see where they lead." Sonali was interested enough by the spectacle to agree to remove the drying clothes, but Franco clicked his tongue after going around looking at them. Their labor had, Tristan saw from the corner of his eye, drawn most everyone else as an audience. A few looked excited, more amused. "Too much is gone," the scholar said. "The altars connected to each other, I think, and perhaps headed for the back wall. I cannot be certain with what little is left." The back wall was something Tristan could work with. From up there he could see what the angle might have been, and there was a carved column leading into an arch facing more or less where the altars would have been. Moving in that direction across the top of the arches, he crouched down to have a closer look. No trace of the chain anywhere near the ground, but atop the curve of the arch, under dust he rubbed away with his thumb, he found the carved chain. The bottom was worn away, but it was facing upwards, towards the first of the stone strips encircling the dome. "Found it," Tristan triumphantly said. It had been as he suspected. The chain began outside, passed through the altars and then slowly rose up the sky, only to lead at a final destination, the smoke hole, which might have another purpose after all. "What is it that you are even looking for?" Franco asked. "You said shrines like this were for trading gifts," the thief said. "And it occurs to me, if the first silhouette is standing on the ground and all the others are holding up another body, what will the last one be holding up?" The toothless professor was not slow. "There might be a gift for the gods at the end," Franco mused. "Symbolically speaking, that is not without sense." The difficult part was getting up there, as the old man's warning had not been unsound. If he fell badly from this height, the thief would break something. Getting a hand into the smoke hole took more acrobatics than he would prefer, feet resting on the highest stripe, his hand on a jutting stone of the ceiling to wedge himself, and then all he could do was peer in the dark above. Shoving in his free hand, he groped around in search of anything at all. It seemed like a dead end, just a hole going upwards, until he pressed against the back and found there was a little give. Not much, though. Inspired, he ran his fingers near the bottom of the stone and found a carved silhouette offering up nothing. Pressing against it, he felt a stone give and suddenly the back wall toppled. Tristan yelped, taking back his hand as the stone fell out and down into the shrine. Franco shouted a curse when it almost fell on his head, but the thief's attention was on the hidden compartment he had revealed. Though he could not see inside, he could feel it out. There was some kind of basin carved into the bottom, a sloping incline, but after he felt out all the sides and even the top of the compartment, Tristan was forced to admit that it was empty. Either the caretakers of this place had taken away their treasure or someone had found it before he could. Enthusiasm dimming, thief carefully made his way down. He still slipped, footing giving away against the side of the column, but by then he was close enough to the ground he was able to fall without even a bruise to show for it. Still hurt, though, almost as much as Franco's gentle smile as the thief rose to his feet and brushed himself off. "I told you it was unlikely," the professor said. "Besides, it is already impressive that you found the hidden compartment." In sharp contrast to the old man's attempt at comfort, Tristan saw from the corner of his eye that Fortuna's head was popping out of the smoke hole. Long golden hair falling like a curtain, she still somehow managed to look down at them contemptuously. Like some queen granting audience to vagabonds, Tristan thought, and that was when it fell into place. "The chain goes both ways," the thief said, cutting through whatever Franco had been saying. The old man frowned. "Obsessing over this will do no good," he said. Tristan turned gray eyes on him. "You said it yourself," he said. "The gods gave gifts as well as received them. If there was something at the end of the chain, there should be something at the beginning too." He would have been willing to look for the first link in the chain himself, but despite his open doubts, Franco led him to it. The small carved silhouette at its feet against the ground of the cavern, as if standing on it, and when Tristan pressed against it nothing gave. He blew at the carving, finding that there were the smallest fracture lines between that first silhouette and the stone around it. It could have been time's work, he thought. But it might not be. Leaning closer, he ran a finger beneath the carved feet and it came back touched with gray stone dust. Grayer than the stone of the cavern wall. To someone's loudly exclaimed disgust, he tasted it. Ha! He had been sure he knew that gray. "There is nothing," Franco said. "Surely you can see." Tristan took out his knife, picking away at the carved silhouette until some chunk of the left leg fell off. Beneath it lay stone of a different gray. The old man wetly coughed into his hand, his breath wheezing. "Is that what I think it is?" Franco said, voice still faint. "If you were thinking in typical stone, then yes," the thief smiled. Vanessa was standing close, a lantern in hand, and when Tristan asked she wordlessly gave it over. He opened the shutter until the naked flame was revealed, then pressed it against the carving. Antipodal stone was believed to be one of the wonders of the antediluvians, for it was a stone that, unlike others, contracted when heated instead of expanding. Some of the great canals of Sacromonte had been built out of it, in times before it became so rare, so Tristan knew the look of the stone. It was not long before he estimated it would be warm enough, the scorched figure of the silhouette hot to the touch, but not so much that with his sleeve covering his fingers he could not pull at it. The stone came free when he pulled, revealing another compartment, and Tristan grinned. "I was wrong," Franco murmured. "Most an error." The thief angled the lantern to have a look inside, triumph blooming when he saw there was an object in there. It was large enough he had to grope at the inside of the compartment for another mechanism, eventually finding out that the sides of the mouth could be pushed further open. What he took out of the compartment looked like a musical instrument of some sort, though not one he knew. It was squatter and longer than a lyre, and its wooden body had long petrified. Strangest, though, was that though were knobs for 7 strings on the crossbar, there were not even the broken remains of one. Tristan pulled it up into the light, feeling something move inside the body when he did. Lightly, and it was near weightless, but there was definitely something within. "That," Franco quietly said, "is a supplicant's cithara." They had attracted a crowd, everyone circling in around them. The thief hid how the number of people behind him was making him uncomfortable. "A musical instrument?" Tristan asked. "One meant only for the hands of priests," the professor explained. "It is played with strings of gloam, to appeal to the gods with prayer songs." "So it's worth a lot?" Len asked, leaning past Vanessa. More than a few considering gazes turned on the cithara at the question. "That depends on the nature of the relic," Franco hedged. "But by itself not particularly, save to collectors." He coughed into his hand. "But inside the cithara's body there will be a substance," he said. "It will have been laid there by the priests who crafted it to shape the nature of the prayers, accumulating power with use. That can be worth a great deal of coin." Tristan raised an eyebrow, pressing the cithara into his hand. The professor looked askance at him for a moment, as if wondering what the meaning of it might be. "The wood is petrified," the thief said. "Turned to stone." And Franco could listen to the echoes lying within stone, could he not? The old man looked startled, then his face pulled into a frown of concentration as he laid an open palm against the cithara. He shivered, arm trembling, and withdrew his hand with a long sigh. "Feathers," Franco told him. "It is feathers inside, meant for songs of sleep." And so by the time Song and Firanda returned, bringing word they had found cultists, and so their group was to try the bridge tonight, Tristan the Brascal was smiling. He had a plan. Chapter 14. They began to feel the bite of the missing supplies on the 3rd day. Angharade had measured her portions from the start, planning for 4 days' worth of meals. Formal registration with the dueling circuit had exempted her from ever having to attend Izuko, the mandatory 4-year schooling, but Mother had seen to it she received some of the training nonetheless. She had not enjoyed the lessons then, but now she saw the use what she'd learned going out into the countryside, how to make a fire, skin an animal and ration her food. Her portions remained the same, but those who had not been as prudent paid for it. Isabel's maids, in particular the redhead, ate little but crumbs for breakfast. That would not do. Angharade cut her meal in half, then in half again, and wordlessly gave a quarter to each. "Thank you," Beatrice sincerely said, bowing her head. "It is very kind of you," Brisida added. The sheer gratitude on their faces made her uncomfortable. She snuck a look at Isabel, who was chatting with the Sheridan brothers as she ate her own meal. It would not have been proper for the mistress to suffer on the behalf of careless servants, it was true, but the dark-haired beauty should have kept a closer eye on her maids in the first place. Though neither Brun nor Song were anything of the sort to her, Angharade had inquired as to their own meals the previous day. Brun had been most amused by her concern, informing her he'd eaten worse in smaller plates, while Song's rationing had been even more strict than her own. Neither of the Sheridan brothers seemed to be running out of food, even though they had been eating larger meals than anyone else. Even Master Cosme, whose plate was usually not much larger than Angharade's. "Ah, in fan zones," Brun smiled, looking at them. Not a breed of men prone to wastefulness, it must be said. They've already spent poor Gaskin's life and now they eat his food. Supplies are supplies, Song pragmatically replied. It is the extravagance that irks me. Angharad could not quite say why it was wrong for the Augusto and Raymond Cheriton to eat the rations of the valet one of them had murdered, but it was. It did not matter that the food was theirs, or that the man who might have had a claim to it had passed. It was wrong. She stewed on that for the rest of breakfast. After all were done, Song brought up the notion that since food was beginning to run out, all should pitch in their provisions for a common stash that would be rationed out fairly between everyone. A Tianxi proposing theft from her betters, Raymond Cheriton sneered. How very surprising. No doubt she'll expect us to vote on it, his older brother laughed. We already share the lantern oil, Braun pointed out. It is only going a step further. The decision had been made unanimously when it became clear they were running out of oil. They had lost 4 lanterns fighting off the lupines, so only 3 were left, but the greater loss had been the skins full of oil. Now there was so little left they had killed 2 lanterns and let only the vanguard of their group carry one that was lit, lest they run the risk of running out before they even left the high road. Having only the light of the stars to walk by would have been dangerous enough, but the prospect of gloam disease was even more fearful than that. It is always only a step further, boy, Augusto lectured, until we kneel with our necks on the chopping block. Angharad frowned at them. There has been no talk of violence or taking from anyone, only an offer to contribute to a common good, she said. It is not for nobles to fill the world's empty bellies, Raymond dismissed. We will run out of loaves long before we run out of beggars. The commons must take responsibility for themselves. The Perduri did not hide her disgust. Did Raymond Cheriton not understand what being a noble was? All men had a trade, a vocation under the sleeping god, and to be born a noble was to learn the trade of leadership, the burden of command. To then let your own go hungry was a fundamental failure of that duty. More disappointingly, the Cheritons were not alone in their opinion. My handmaids are free to join such an arrangement if they wish, Isabel said, but I will not. I will see to my affairs without needing the help of others. The offer was the nail in the coffin of Song's proposal, for now neither she nor Braun were inclined to continue the plan. The maids had nothing to contribute to the pot, meaning in practice they would be fed at the expense of those who filled it. Angharad understood she had no right to expect the 2 of them to take food off their plates for strangers. But for all that everyone had their good and proper reasons, the result was still that 2 of their company would go hungry. The selfishness of it all was cloying. She rose brusquely to her feet, anger caught in her throat. It is not much, Angharad stiffly told the maids, but I will share again at supper what I did for this meal. The 3 of them would go hungry, but hunger passed. Dishonor would not. Isabel smiled at her, but Angharad's answering gaze was cool as she went to grab her back. Sometimes people were less than you had thought them to be. After they resumed the march, it was not entirely a surprise when Isabel joined her at the back. Angharad was yet under oath, she could not have approached the other herself. With Song and Beatrice walking in front of them while Augusto and Raymond Cheriton tipped the vanguard far ahead, they even had a modicum of privacy. I will be sharing half my meals with them as well, Angharad, the Infanzona quietly told her. But it would have served no good to shame the brothers before everyone. She studied Isabel from the corner of her eye, wondering if she was being appeased. No, she decided. Isabel was not scheming, only too prone to playing the peacemaker even when the other side was undeserving of compromise. It was a flaw born of kindness, not something baser. Speaking for your own is your responsibility, she finally said. Your maids deserve better than silence. Irritation flashed in the Infanzona's green eyes. They might, Isabel sharply replied, but I imagine they yet prefer being on speaking terms with the man whose contract is the sole way for us to get down from this aqueduct. Angharad had not considered that, she would admit, but duty was duty. It is a matter of honor, she said. Nobles have obligations, Isabel. There is honor in keeping everyone breathing, the Infanzona retorted, and it means keeping the brothers happy. Do you not understand that every time one of them has the watch they could simply leave us? Isabel swallowed, obviously distressed. Angharade, they could take the food and the lanterns and go, she said, snapping her fingers. Just like that, leaving us stranded. And why wouldn't they? You swore to kill one of them and Song's map has lost its use. There is only one reason for them to stay. The woman they were both courting, Isabel did not need to say, and Angharade felt her anger ebb away. It would have been a fine thing to say that she'd been convinced by the soundness of the argument, and it genuinely was sound. Open contempt from the woman they were courting might well drive the brothers away just as Isabel feared. But the truth was that the tremor in Isabel's voice and the fear on her face did more to convince Angharade to let go of her indignation than all the rest. Who was she to cast blame, when she had not even noticed the burden laying on the Infanzona's shoulders? "It will be all right," she quietly said, laying gentle a hand on the Isabel's wrist. "Only one more day to the end of the high road, and then they will have no power over us." She let out a long breath, leaning into Angharade's shoulder. "I am tired," she admitted. "And afraid. None of it has gone the way I thought it would." "My uncle told me it would be a hard journey," Angharade said, "but it has been trying in different ways than I had expected." "So it has," Isabel snorted, pushing back a curl. "To think we could be at risk of gloam disease in this day and age." "We will not be for some time," Angharade absent-mindedly replied. Curious green eyes turned on her. "You know of the process?" "My mother was a sea captain," she replied. "Few know the terror of that disease better than sailors. Particularly those who sailed the straying sea, which unlike the Trebian had no light shine down on it from firmament. Only the royal house's great triumph, the serpentine roads, dared to cut through that once unbroken darkness. It takes 7 days entirely without glare or a month with less than 2 hours a day exposed for the disease to take," Angharade continued. "So long as we keep eating our meals under lantern light and keeping watch with the same, we are not at risk." "I have heard Mulaney study the disease more deeply than any other," Isabel hesitantly said. "That they have measured what it does to men." "The basics are common knowledge back home," she admitted. Clearing her throat, she pitched her voice higher. 7 dead and 1 alive, the last in dark to thrive," Angharade sang. All children of the Isles were taught the nursery rhyme. Mulaney scholars had found that out of 10 men who contracted gloam disease, the results cut towards an average, 7 would die, 2 turn darkling and 1 survive. Mother had always said that the hollowing was more common than that, however, and that sometimes those headed for death could be saved if they were bathed in direct glare for long enough, the burning light that straight fell from the cracks in firmament, not the gentler glow of antediluvian devices. Isabel shivered against her. "What a dreadful verse," Isabel murmured, "but I suppose it lays out the endings plain." "It is meant to be sobering," Angharade said, slipping her arm into the other woman's and squeezing it. "That way children remember to stay out of the gloam, especially in the countryside." Malin and its sister islands, Pereter and Uthugil, were not under a part of firmament where the antediluvians had built wonders. It was only a great pit of glare that made the islands habitable, and that light was not as sophisticated as that of lands with older blessings. Between the shadows cast by the lay of the land and the Challenger, that great wandering machine high up in the sky, cutting through the light, there was no end of nooks and crannies where a careless soul might find a bad end. "It is not natural to stay out of the light for too long," Isabel agreed. "It presses against the soul of all those not estranged from the circle perpetual." "We have been weathering it fine for now, I would say," Angharade replied. Isabel prettily smiled, then leaned close. For a golden, terrifying heartbeat Angharade thought she was about to be kissed, but instead the Infanzona tugged her coat into place. "There, that's better," Isabel said, smirking in a way that told she knew exactly what she'd just done. Angharade cleared her throat. She had not blushed, at least. "Thank you," she got out. "It is nothing," she airily replied. "If you must thank me for anything, let it be for this. We are not all taking to the dark as well you think. Your helper Brun, for example." "He is not a helper," the Perduri said, "but a companion." "A companion who does all you ask him to and keeps the same foes," Isabel drily replied. "But call him a companion if you like, The reluctance is part of your charm, I think. Angharad was not sure whether she was flattered or insulted, but either way she pushed through. Brun has been well enough, she finally said. Why do you believe otherwise? He puts on a good show when we have meals, or when he is paired with someone else, Isabel conceded. Even when he speaks with dear Brasida. Yet the moment he is not, a black mood takes him. Angharad's brows rose in surprise. Not a speck of emotion on his face, Isabel continued, and he grows restless. Always reaching for that hatchet of his while the eye wanders. I had no notion, she admitted. I doubt he would take well to an attempt to comfort, the Infanzona noted. Men rarely do, from a woman whose skirts they are not trying to slide under. I mention it only so you might keep an eye on him. I will, Angharad swore. Brun had been good and kind, she would not repay these things by letting the gloam of him. While the eponymous sickness was some of the worst of what the dark held in store, it was hardly the only illness born of it. Most of them were of the mind. It was not rare for men to go mad, in pieces or all at once, for the lack of light. Good, Isabel smiled. You are one of the pillars of this company, after all. It would not do for you to act otherwise. You overestimate my influence, Angharad dismissed. Do I? The green-eyed beauty said. Around you gathers the capacity for much violence, Angharad. 2 fine fighters and then yourself. There's a reason I believe the brothers would flee, not attempt to fight you for the reins of power. Even if that were true, she said, what does it help? I agreed with Song, this morning, that we should share the food. It did no good. I usually find, when I am refused, that I simply did not ask the right way, Isabel said. Angharad shot the Infanzona an amused look. Yes, she did not find it all that difficult to believe that few would refuse her much of anything. Only the amusement faded when she found Isabel meeting her gaze squarely, a look almost unkind in them. No, Angharad thought, not unkind. It was the same she had seen on some of the tutors Mother arranged for, men and women who had agreed to meet to Angharad only out of courtesy for the reputation of the famed Captain Tredigger. She had had to prove she was worth their time, their lessons. She had been tested then and she was being tested now. Wrenching her gaze away, she kept her eyes peeled ahead. She had not asked the right way, according to Isabel, but she could not see the Cheritons agreeing to anything she proposed. She had struck a bargain with Raymond and he had become friendlier in the shallowest of manners since, but that did not make them of one mind. Cosma Flora was unlikely to intercede on her behalf either, and Isabel had made it clear she could not afford to openly pick a side. There was a saying in Pareter, that a man's name had 2 halves, his deepest regret and his heart's desire. To know either was to own half his name, to know both was to have him bound as tightly as any spirit. So what was it the Cheriton brothers wanted, that she could use it against them? They wanted to inherit, badly enough to strike deals with enemies to rid themselves of their rival. Badly enough that Master Cosm was here as much to protect them from one another as the trials themselves. Only Angharad had already made bargains using that desire, and to use a lever too much was to break it. Could she muster Song and Brun to try to force the notion? Perhaps, but there was no guarantee it would work. More likely the confrontation would drive the Infanzones away in the night. It could not come from her, Angharad decided. She was the enemy, even to the Cheriton she had made alliance with. The silence lingered between she and Isabel, enough to unsettle her, but the Infanzona waited without a word or a trace of boredom on her face. Quietly expected, and so Angharad forced her mind down furrows she had already dug. If not from her, then from who? Isabel had dismissed Brun as being her helper, and though she was wrong in this the brothers might share that opinion. That barred either he or Song from being an answer. That left only the maids and Isabel, for the brothers were unlikely to willingly get food off their plate on behalf of people they largely disliked and held in contempt. Did they even like anyone of their company save Isabel? And their Angharad stilled, for the brother did indeed like Isabel. Perhaps even loved her, though she had her doubts. One of the reasons the Cheriton brothers were so ardently courting Isabel Ruesta was the wealth of the Infanzona's house, which making ties to would surely see the earner rise above his brother to inherit their family's title. It was a shade of the heart's desire, half the name seized by a different grip, and the openings were all there, weren't they? Angharade carefully put the pieces together in her mind. Isabel's maids had been given permission to join the arrangement of shared food, and Isabel was going to share part of her meal with them. All that needed doing was to nudge the events a little further along. "Have you considered," Angharade said, "giving your entire meals to your maids?" Surprise flicked across the other woman's face, a flash of it followed by Isabel breathing in sharply and releasing a little laugh. "Oh," she said. "That is clever." It was the Perduria's turn to start. "You were not leading me towards such a solution?" she slowly asked. "Not at all, darling," Isabel chuckled. "There were other ways, but I really should not be surprised this is what you thought of." She shook her head with wry amusement. "It is all very Mulaney, yes? The lady gives away her meals to her servants, noble indeed, and naturally when she ends up without anything the lords courting her will fight for the privilege of providing. Gallantry all around, with just a hint of the mercenary sensibilities lying beneath." The last sentence she spoke with open approval, which had Angharade grimacing. Not, however, disagreeing. That was the ugly truth of the words exact, the one her father had made sure to teach her. If you cleaved only to the letter of honor, honor had a way of ending up being what was most advantageous to you. No matter how callous or cruel. When the father of devils appeared in the great tales, the king of hell never spoke a single lie or broke a single oath. It made Lucifer no less dangerous. A single whisper from him had been enough to turn Isay the great, first and finest king of Malon, into a bloodthirsty tyrant. She was broken out of her ruminations by Isabel laying a head against her shoulder. "You are prone to brooding, Angharade," she said. "We will have to fix that." "How ambitious of you," she drawled back, "when we will only have so long together." "Until the end of the second trial is not so long, my lady." "Oh, my life will not end after the trial of ruins," Isabel flirted back. "It is why I want to take it in the first place, darling." She flicked a meaningful glance ahead. "With such an achievement to my name, my parents will allow me greater latitude to choose who I may tie myself to," Isabel said. "A cause worth fighting for," Angharade replied, only half jesting. "I thought you might say that," Isabel Ruesta smiled, green eyes warm with promise. There was only so long the two of them could nestle against one another at the back of the company without being seen, so when lunch grew close they reluctantly parted ways. Perhaps it was for the best, Angharade thought, for if she'd felt Isabel's lips whispering against her ear or her neck one more time she might have ended up doing something very unwise. And by the knowing look Song gave her when they sat down for the meal, they had not gone entirely unseen after all. Angharade was in too good a mood to feel all that chided, which seemed to amuse the Tianxi. She was careful not to pay too much attention while the trick she had agreed on with Isabel unfolded, the maids with their full plates offering to contribute to a joint stash of food while their lady sat smiling at them without a speck of food to show for. Augusto was the first to offer his meal, Raymond looking like he was about to curse when his older brother beat him to it. Isabel offered to take only half from each, ever the peacemaker, and the pair spent more time glaring at each other than noticing anything else. Master Cosme caught her eye, cocking an eyebrow at her, and she shrugged innocently. The man chuckled, stroking his mustache, and tipped what would have been his hat at her. Angharade smiled back but kept her attention on the arrangements for the food. There was precious little bargaining, the two maids aware they were being welcomed into the pact from a position of weakness, and it was elected that Song would see to the rationing itself. It was to begin with supper and end with arrival at the second trial. The maids remained close to them as they ate, the most Angharade had seen of them since the journey began, and it became clear that in Isabel's absence the two did not bother to hide their common dislike. Brasida, the well-mannered redhead, kept fiddling with a small ivory trinket. It was a needle with a sculpted head, too large for sewing and so likely meant for keeping hair in place. "It is quite pretty," Brun complimented. "A gift from your family?" "From poor old Gaskin, in truth," Brasida replied, preening at the compliment. "He wanted gambling during our first night on the island and gave it to me the following day." "How kind of him," Beatrice drily said. "Entirely unprompted, I'm sure." A poisonous glare was turned on her. "We cannot all earn precious stones from rats, I suppose," Brysida smilingly replied. "Whatever did you do for it, dear Beatrice? I can only hope you weren't taken advantage of." "Going through my affairs again, I see," Beatrice coldly replied. "And to think I am the one from the murk." Angharade cleared her throat, interrupting them before the bickering could get out of hand. "A lovely needle indeed," she said. "Do you intend to use it with your hair, Brysida?" The maids sheathed their claws when the conversation turned, Brun offering her a grateful look for the intervention. The rest of the meal was spent on idle conversation, and before long they were on the march again. Tempting as it was to try to sneak another moment with Isabel in the dark, Angharade resisted the urge to try and walked with Song near the middle of their column instead. Before they could even begin to converse, the entire company ground to a halt when Master Cosmo let out a shout from the front. "Everyone down," the old soldier hissed. "Boy, close the lantern." The fear in his voice killed any hesitation there might have been at following the order. Angharade flattened herself against the bottom of the high road while Brun, who had been in front with Cosmo, closed the lantern's shutter. All Angharade glimpsed before lying down against the stone was a tall silhouette striding across the plains in the distance, some feathered creature. For what might have been the better part of an hour they stayed there, only Cosmo raising his head over the edge to look, and finally the old soldier told them to get up after it was gone. "What was that thing?" Raymond Sheridan asked. "A great bird, my lord," Cosmo Flor darkly replied. "We do not want to ever draw one's attention." All the Sacramontans looked shaken at the name, and Song as well, leaving Angharade the outsider. She had never heard of such a spirit. They resumed the journey in a strange mood, Augusto Sheridan's too loud boasts to Isabel that he would have protected her from the Lemure ringing unpleasantly. The elder brother was more careful with his words than the younger, but not so much as to be called careful without the comparison. Remembering what he had said about chopping blocks that very morning, Angharade flushed with embarrassment. The insult had not been implicit in the slightest, only not spoken to Song directly. "I apologize for Lord Augusto's lack of manners this morning," she quietly told the Tianxi. "There was no call for him to imply you have such bloody intentions, no matter the politics of the republics. I'm sure no end of little nobles are tucked in at night to tales of Republicans coming to chop off their heads if they've been bad," Song sadly said, "but I assure you the stories are exaggerated. It is only in the southernmost 3 republics, the Sanxing, that nobles were all sent to the block." Angharade started in surprise. "I was taught that there are no nobles in Tianxia," she slowly said. "Was this wrong?" "There are no titles, certainly," Song replied. "But the northern republics came late to the fold, and some less eagerly than others. Many nobles there were granted high positions in the bureaucracy after laying down their old rights. Their families remain rich and influential to this day." "That is not nobility," Angharade told her, not unkindly. "It is corruption." For some reason the Tianxi looked very amused. "They still have to take the examinations," she said. "Those unsuitable to serve are weeded out, worry not. It is a compromise only Yellow Earth purists take issue with." These Angharade had heard of. Tianxi radicals hatching conspiracies all over Vesper, assassins and fomenters of rebellion. That the republics might not endorse their actions but equally refuse to denounce them was one of the reasons Tianxia was so often at war with its neighbors. The Perduri often found it hard to reconcile how a people so sensible over other matters could be so senseless in this one. "There is no need to look so troubled, Angharade," Song teased. "I only speak of this to make it plain that firebrand hatred is not common. I even studied the Millennium classics, I'll have you know." "The great tales," Angharade said, impressed. "I must confess I have only read Ships of Morn and The Madness of King Isay. It was tradition that written amour be learned through the great tales, even if the language was dated." She had despised it so much as a child that father had only made her read the 2 most exciting of the tales, the ones full of battles and rebellions and gory ends. If Song had read all 9 of the works, it was a worthy achievement. "Were they translated into Antigua or Cathayan?" she asked. "In the original Amoya," Song replied flawlessly in that very language. How rare, Angharad enthused in the same. I only ever learned Antigua and some Gwent myself. The ancient Perdiri language was considered uncouth to speak in Malay society, and only solely used by commoners deep in the Dutchies countryside. I've always wanted to learn Gwent, Song admitted. There are all these lovely sounding songs from before Morn's arrival that your people put to writing. My mother would not hear of it, though, kept me on Setson and Samratrava, the two most common tongues of, respectively, the Kingdom of Easkli and the Imperial Someshwar. Angharad did not stare, but it was a close thing. Song, she delicately said, may I ask how many languages you do speak? 7 fluently, the Tiangsi replied. Were you to be an interpreter, by any chance? Angharad tried. The other one's face turned serious. I had an unusual upbringing, Song admitted. But we have strayed far enough from our thread, I would think. If you did not take to the great works, may I ask what you did enjoy? The subject change was gentle, but no less firm for it. The noblewoman would not be so discourteous as to ignore it. I am fond of poetry, Angharad said. Some Leerganan greats, Ilaria and Alfonso in particular, but firstly the Milani luminaries. Ibanathi is my favorite. She only realized what she had said after it was too late to bite down on the words. Quietly mortified, Angharad snuck a sideways look at Song. Perhaps the Tiangsi was unaware that the poetess Ibanathi was famous for her verses about her pining affections for a woman. Or that, in some circles, asking another woman if she had read Ibanathi was considered an indirect way to ask if she too had an interest in the fairer sex. Song smiled at her. Oh, I have never heard of Ibanathi before, she said. What did she write? Several books of poems, Angharad vaguely replied. They defy easy description. I must see to acquiring them after the trials, then, the silver-eyed woman decided. Perhaps you can explain them to me. The mortification piled on, and still the Tiangsi offered her that innocent smile, unknowingly twisting the knife. Although, Angharad thought as she narrowed her eyes, that smile might be a little too innocent. You are making sport of me, she accused. Oh, distant firmament, break my back. Song theatrically recited, hand over her heart. It would be kinder than your frown. She had not thought to hear the ode to Isa recited to her here, much less in perfect Amoya. It was more embarrassing than she might have dreamed of. This is most unwarranted, Angharad plaintively said. I will spare you this once, Song aloud. But only if you formally renounce the belief you might have ever been subtle about your preferences. I hid nothing, but neither did I trumpet it about, she protested. It might have been more akin to a drum, Song conceded. Not at the forefront, yet effectively impossible to miss. The obvious amusement on the other woman's face was contagious, for all that Angharad was being the figure of fun. It was meant with such an obvious lack of bile that her own lips could not help but twitch. I will have you know that, someone ahead, Brun suddenly announced. The change that came over their company was instant. Weapons were eyed in the blink of an eye, Angharad's own saber leaving the sheath, and all eyes went forward as the Infanzones let better fighters pass them. Only there was nothing but darkness ahead, even in the light of the lantern Cosm was now hoisting up. This is no laughing matter, boy, Master Cosm harshly said. If you think I can sense the living, Brun had told her. People best, hollows and beasts with more difficulty. I believe him, Angharad cut in, coming forward. She gently pressed aside Isabel, then brushed past Augusto to join the two at the front. Her eyes went to Brun, whose face was calm but eyes had grown cold. He was preparing for a fight. How many? She asked him. Either one or two, he murmured. Hollows, so it's hard to tell. He leaned in closer. I cannot distinguish height, Brun whispered in her ear. They could be below. Maybe 400-500 feet ahead. She grimaced, nodding her understanding. Cosm's eyes moved between the two of them, narrowed, and the man was not a fool. He no longer asked questions or doubted Brun's word, drawing his sword with the hand not already holding his pistol. Should we kill the lantern? She asked him. He shook his head. No point, hollows see better than us in the dark, Master Cosm said. "Hard to take them by surprise. On a narrow road like this, our best bet is rushing in." She nodded in agreement. "Then we need a vanguard," Angharad said. "I volunteer." The veteran smiled roguishly. "As expected," he said. "I'll go with you." He glanced back. "Pistols and muskets out," Cosma Floor ordered. "Take a shot if you have a clear one, but otherwise hold your fire." Tension thrummed across her skin when they moved to the front, limbering limbs. With Brun's help they might take the enemy by surprise, his contract peering ahead better than sight, but she would not bet on it. Lanterns could be seen from far away in an island without much light. She shared a nod with Cosm, then began moving. Long strides at first, then quickening into a run and rushing headfirst into as quickly as they could. Brun was holding the lantern behind them, casting his glow ahead, but Angharad still missed the signs. She thought it a curve in the stone until the dusty gray cloak nestled against the left edge of the aqueduct was thrown off, a tattooed pale man unloading his crossbow right at Cosm. She struck out in an arc sweeping upwards and Cosm ducked, the bolt tearing through his cheek. Her strike was too early, slowed her blow, catching the bolt's head and sending it skittering up while Cosm ducked with a shout. A heartbeat later he unloaded his pistol at the hollow as the man tried to get up, the ball hitting metal under a hair shirt and knocking the man back down. Angharad rushed forward, eyes sweeping the high road for any trace of the second, but she found nothing. Only stone and shit, Angharad thought, eyes straying to the side as she saw a slender silhouette running away in the plains below. They were near and dark in the aqueduct, the other darkling must have been hiding under it. "Someone shoot," she called out, only for a sharp crack to interrupt her. The back of the runner's head burst red, Song's impeccable aim claiming another life. Good, she fiercely thought. The coward would not be able to send for reinforcements. The hollow up on the aqueduct began to rise again, but she was on him and smashed her boot into his chin, putting him down, then hacked at the hand bringing up a curved blade to slash at her. There was a scream of pain as her steel bit deep as bone, the hollow's sword clattering on the ground, and she laid a boot on his chest to keep him on the ground. Cosm was by her side a moment later, smashing the pommel of his sword in the hollow's face. The unsettlingly pale man, who she now saw was not tattooed but ritually scarred, fell in a daze. "You want a prisoner?" Cosm asked. Angharad hesitated. There was no reason for the hollow to talk save if they promised to set him free, which she could not risk, or through torture, which she would not countenance. The matter was settled when a thrown hatchet sunk between the hollow's eyes with a whooping wet sound, right into the skull. Death was near instant, Brun sliding past her as she stood struck with surprise to wrench free his weapon. He met her stare head-on. "Too dangerous to live," the fair-haired Sacramontan simply said. There was, though, something like satisfaction in his eyes. Had Isabel seen the truth of it? Was the dark affecting him? Angharad studied the lay of his shoulders, how they seemed to loosen, and decided that not. He had been restless because darkness was not an enemy he could fight, but now that he'd fought, however short the fight, he had bled out some of the unease. It sat ill with Angharad that the hollow had been killed without a weapon in hand, but this was a battle and not a duel. Honor had not been breached. "You are not wrong," she finally said, and that was the end of that. The rest of the company caught up and some few moments investigating found where the hollows had been camped. Up on the high road there had been nothing but a waterskin, gratefully added to their reserves, under the large gray cloak, but below the arch was a pair of bedrolls and what looked like stripes of dried meat along a basket of black tomatoes. Song found how the hollow had climbed up, a knotted rope ending in hooks that had been hidden along the curve of the arch. Its existence led to heated debate, Brun and the Cherdon arguing someone should climb down and seize the supplies. "There are 2 fresh corpses about and we are deep in the island," Song flatly replied. "Every breath we waste here is a danger." Angharad found it distasteful to take from the dead, even though within certain bounds it was no taint on honor, so she was inclined to agree. As did Isabel, who wanted to leave this place as swiftly as possible. The argument might have gone on for longer had Beatrice not suddenly let out a startled cry. Angharad reached for her blade again, following the maid's gaze, and found a slice of darkness blotting out distant stars. "Harwalk," Song shouted. It would take more than a blade to kill this, Angharad realized, for as the beat of great wings became deafening she saw that the descending shape was tall as 3 men. Master Cosm dropped the lantern, hurriedly cramming powder, and shot down his pistol, and in that toppled trembling light the Perdiri saw a storm of oily feathers. Talons thicker than her legs tore into the hollow's corpse, ripping it apart like wet paper, and in eerie silence the spirit unfolded its wings. "It is a man," Angharad thought incredulously. Within the black feathers lay a silhouette of tarnished gold, arms and legs outlined in golden wire as they led up to a helmeted head. But the arms thickened, twisted, turning into golden feathers where there should have been hands. The entire man shivered, and only then did she realize it was nothing but color on feathers, colors that seemed too deep to truly be that. Angharad only realized she had gone still, that all sound had fled her ears, when Brun barreled into her. They both fell on the hard stone, the Sacramontan hastily getting out an apology as they rose to their feet. Behind them Song snapped off a shot right in the eyes of the golden helm, but though feathers gave the spirit cared not. While Angharad had been entranced, Cosm had been thrown down, wounded in a way that left a black scar on his face, and Augusto was dragging him off while screaming as the top of his lungs. Why? The creature barely even moved, only watching them as it nonchalantly tore at the hollow's corpse. "It's too old for lead," Song cursed. "We need to run. From a spirit that could fly. It would be pointless. They could only fight." Breathing out, Angharad pushed down her fear and turned to face the golden frame. Distance would be hard to measure, with so little light, but it was not so different from shadow fighting. She could do this, the Perdiri told herself, and rushed forward. Someone behind shouted her name, but she could not find it in herself to care. It felt distant. "You are home, Mother," she whispered, stumbling forward. "Yes. Come to me. You are home." Had it all been a dream? The fire and the screams and the people hounding her to the ends of the earth. She took a step forward, back slick with sweat. "You are safe," Mother sang to her. "You are home. You are mine." She could feel the warmth of the hearth, her mother's embrace. Only even as took another step, she felt it slip through her fingers. The warmth was leaving, cold running through her veins. The coolness of water in the dark, in a deep place that only silence knew. And a voice spoke through her, though it was not a voice, it was the tide eating away the cliffside, the cry of gulls picking at corpses, the sound of men kneeling. It was the patient crawl of the inexorable. "Know your place," the fisher chided. Angharad came back to herself as the golden stingers that had been closing around her face like grotesque fingers tore away, the spirit screeching in pain as it tried to cover its head with its wings. She hacked at the body, blade sliding into the feathers as if they were made of oil, and withdrew her dripping saber with a shiver of disgust. There was nothing she could do, she realized, and so she fled. Whatever it was her patron had done to the spirit, it was soon gone, and she'd barely taken 3 steps before its wings unfolded again. "Brasida," Isabel said in a trembling voice. "Do it. My lady, do it." And Angharad saw as the red-headed maid took a step forward, ashen-faced, and turned her eyes on the spirit looming over them all. She clapped her hands. The terrifying ring of it threw the noblewoman down against the stone, as if a ship had smashed into a cliff right above her head. Her cheek against the aqueduct, dirt and blood in her mouth, Angharad crawled forward. Behind her, the spirit, the Harwalk, was rippling like a pond in the wind. All save for the silhouette of gold painted on its feathers. Again, Isabella commanded, tone grown firmer. Brasida clapped her hands and went blue against Angharad's braids, the spirit screeching behind her. The Perdiri rose to her feet and out of the way, Brun helping her up. She turned just in time to see the Harwalk rip into the hollow's corpse, screeching in hatred at them, but flinching away when the red-headed maid drew back her hands. Alice's scream of hate, and the spirit leapt off the edge of the aqueduct, great wings spreading, and fled into the night. "Are you all right?" Brun gently asked her. "Fine," she got out. "I was protected." She could no longer feel the fisher's presence. The old spirit would have let her die, she knew, if it had been Claus or Fang that were to take her. But the Harrowak had tried to take her soul, and that the fisher had not been willing to countenance. He had a claim to it, until their bargain was done. And a good thing that you were, Song bit out, looking her over from head to toe like a fretting mother. Harrowaks eat the souls they take, Angarade, but slowly. It is decades of screaming torment. Then I must give Brysida my thanks twice over, she replied, turning to find the handmaid. She was currently kneeling on the floor, Isabel standing over her and soothing her back as the redhead desperately ate what looked like a white powdery tablet. Aside from Cosm's face wound and the way Augusto Sheridan was cradling his left arm, their company seemed to have made it out unharmed. They would not have, Angarade thought, had the creature been more interested in eating their bodies than their souls. Pushing down the grim thought, she returned her gaze to the strange spectacle of Brysida. A Sacramentan remedy? She ventured. Learganon medicine still hewed too close to the practices of the Second Empire, all new, and so their doctors were hardly better than the plague. No, Brun quietly replied, eyes hooded. That's chalk. Tablets of chalk. His parents had been miners, Angarade recalled. None of them further commented on Brysida crunching down on an entire tablet the length long as the beginning of the noblewoman's wrist to the tip of her fingers. If it was not medicine, then it was a contract's price, and not something to be discussed when the handmaid had just saved all their lives. The redhead was half weeping, Isabel gently holding her as she finished the last of the chalk and began retching. Another, Brysida rasped. Fuck, he wants another. She was noisily sick a heartbeat later and they all looked away. In the songs, in the stories, spirits asked beautiful things of those they made bargains with, a song of true love, the beat of a butterfly's wings, a blade quenched in devil's blood. But those were songs, and truth was not so pretty. Sometimes spirits wanted baser things as payment, like the sensation of a woman eating chalk no matter what the eating did to her body. At Brun's quiet suggestion they went to pull up the rope the Hollows had used to climb the aqueduct. After the Harrowak's visit, there was no more talk of lingering there, it might yet come back, or a more dangerous spirit grow curious of the racket. Brysida had to eat most of a second tablet, but that one at least she kept down. They moved out the moment she could stand, Angarade putting away the rope in her bag without a word. They fled forward into the dark, only a shivering lantern light guiding them. Chapter 15. It had already been a difficult day, so naturally it began raining. Only a patter at first, nothing like the sheets of icy water Pareter's coasts enjoyed springing on its dwellers, but it grew. Within an hour they could hardly see in front of the even with the lantern, stumbling along carefully. Master Cosm pointed out a silver lining, that few lemurs could fly in such weather and none could follow a scent through it, but wet feet spoke louder than his optimism. It did not stop there, Angarade had near forgot that the high road was an aqueduct, after using it for a highway so long, but now she was up to her ankles in the reminder. The rain had filled the aqueduct's body up to their ankles, and were it not so rich with broken edges the water would have run even higher. Between wading against the current on now treacherous footing, all of them being soaked to the bone through their clothes and the wind beginning to hurl itself at them from the east, cold, it felt as if none of them were wearing coats, the mood took a grim turn. It did not help that not all were recovered from the encounter with the Harrowak. Angarade was yet dazed, prone to staring out into the storm, and though Cosm had cleaned out the wound he had taken on his face the flesh was still dark. They were both better off than Augusto Sheridan, whose left arm was broken, and better still than poor Brysida. The handmaid had been sick since eating her chalk tablets, enough that the wind and rain slowed her advance to a crawl. Brun was helping her keep pace, but the two were at the back of the company and certain to stay there. Angarade made sure to pull back and stay with them a span whenever they trailed behind too much. She caught an irritated expression on Brun's face once or twice, but she would tell him later no insult was meant to his efforts. It was only that if they lost the pair in the storm, there was no telling when the two would be able to catch up. Better to slow their entire company than to risk it. They all felt the change in the current around 2 hours before dinner, the way it was now pulling forward instead of back. It was good news. Angharad was informed as a few of them pulled close together and shouted over the rainstorm's din to understand each other. It meant they were close to a break in the aqueduct, one they had planned to reach hours ago. They had passed the great river without even realizing, and by now they must be surrounded by woods. If they pushed on after dinner time, they ought to reach the end of the high road today. Since no one was eager to sleep in a river, Angharad, the notion was agreed on. The first break in the high road was subtle enough Beatrice almost walked off the edge. She was pulled back shrieking by Raymond Cherton, who promptly shouted for a halt. It was only a break of about 5 feet, though unnaturally neat, as if some giant's sharp sword had sliced through the aqueduct. If not for the weather they might have been expected to make the jump, but as things stood Raymond was prevailed upon to use his contract. First a ring for them to step on, halfway, then another above and to the side of it for them to hold on to. "Some of you have gloves," Song shouted into the rain. "They should be shared with whoever crosses." Not even the Cherton brothers tried to argue that holding a cloth to the rings of light would be enough in such weather. Good. Angharad had not been looking forward to again pulling her sleeves forward and grasping the light through them. If she slipped even a little, she would be holding the burning radiance. She was the third to cross, using Isabel's gloves and passing them back to a leaning Brun, and once across with her pack she followed Cosme to the edge to share in his grimace. The small break had only been the first, leading onto an elevated island 10 feet long. The real precipice lay ahead, almost 40 feet of mostly missing aqueduct, with some arches still standing but no funnel over them. "It may be too dangerous to cross," Master Cosme yelled. The man passed a hand through his drenched hair, clearly regretting the loss of his hat. Angharad sympathized. With how much rain her braids had taken, it felt like someone had hung a waterskin against the back of her head. "We cannot camp here," Angharad shouted back. "There's no other way." "He'll need to be carried after," Cosme told her. "The contract is hard on his body." "Then we will carry him," the Perdiri insisted. There was no arguing with the needs of the moment, so before long Raymond Cherton set to tracing his rings of light across the gap. It was a thing surreal, almost out of a play, to see the man hanging in the air in the middle of a storm with only slices of light to stand on, making a foothold and handhold every time. Had Angharad not been able to glimpse the clear terror on the younger Cherton's face, she might have thought him a spirit. Lord Raymond slowed near the end, his limbs grown stiff, and only narrowly made it to the other side. He collapsed the moment he reached there, though to everyone's relief the rings stayed. Not knowing how long that would be the case, they set to crossing in a hurry. It was one of the most thoroughly unpleasant experiences in Angharad's life. The rain somehow made the solid light slippery, and with the wind whipping it in her face she could barely see the rings ahead of her. Twice she had to hold on for dear life to one of the handhold rings as her boots slipped, fear icily seizing her limbs, and when she threw herself at the end of the road her angle was off, she fell and bruised her knees against the aqueduct's bottom, cold water running down from her collarbones to her belly. It was a good thing she carried no black powder, for it would surely have been ruined. As the fourth to cross, Angharad found that others had already helped Raymond to sit up, but also that he was no better for it. Though he stayed out of the lantern's light, all the skin she glimpsed had turned pale as ivory and she hardly saw him move save for breathing. The infanzon was half a statue already and there were still others yet to cross. Stomach and nuts at the though of what might happen to him and the others both, Angharad stalked around the end of the ring road with nervous impatience. They had a stroke of luck when the storm began to calm, the rain growing sparser, but it would only get them so far. By the time the last of them began the crossing, Raymond could only move with a shallow breath. Not even to blink. Augusto was the last to cross, and in a way he was lucky. The storm was near dead by now, the rain barely more than a patter and the wind more of a breeze. The Cherton made better time than any of them all the way across, lights winking out behind him, as he made haste. On the last foothold he threw them all a cocky grin, his only good hand releasing the handhold ring before he leapt. The wind picked up halfway through. Angharad was standing close, still stalking about, so she saw the horror writ plain on his face. His jump fell short, brushed aside, and he hit the edge of the aqueduct with his belly. Hands scrabbled against wet, smooth stone while water flowed into his face. Screams of surprise and dismay sounded behind her, but Angharad was already moving. She caught his arm as it slid back, clothes ripping, but her fingers tightened around his wrist and she held tight with gritted teeth. She was kneeling in the water and, sleeping God, she could feel her boots slip. "Help her," Isabel shouted. Cosme was there a moment later, pulling at Augusto's shoulder, and between the two of them they hoisted him over the edge. Augusto crawled through the wet, eyes wild and limbs shaking as he fled the edge of the aqueduct. "Gods," the Infanzon croaked. "Gods." Catching her breath, Angharad knelt by his side and closed her eyes. Her heart was beating as wildly as his must. She might have stayed there a while, rain flowing down her face, had the Infanzon not tugged at her sleeve. "Thank you," Augusto Cherton said. "Lady Tredegar. I did not think you would." "We are under truce," Angharad said. "Your safety is yet my concern." It was not the reason she had moved. In the moment, she had only seen a man about to die. Honor's laws had only caught up to her hands after the deed. The dark-haired noble swallowed, nodding, and looked torn. "The rings only support the weight of one man," he said, tone somewhere between a plea and a concession. "There was no other way for us to live. The knife, it was a mercy. Better that than to be eaten alive." Her face hardened. "Then we should have died," Angharad flatly replied. "There are some lines good men do not cross." His cheeks were already red from the cold, but anger reddened them yet more. "I should have known better," Augusto Cherton spat out. "Go on, then, Tredegar. Honor has been satisfied. You need not keep my company any longer." It sounded fine by her, so she stiffly took her leave. Even after that close call their company agreed to press on, for now that the storm was weak they were certain to be able to descend from the high road that night. The original plan, Angharad learned, had been for their company to camp up on the aqueduct for safety and then descend the following morning. That method would also allow Raymond, who was still unmoving as marble, to rest before using his contract again. Instead they would be using the rope taken from the hollows that Angharad was carrying so they might find shelter down in the woods away from the water. It would take hours, after all, for the aqueduct to empty even after rain ceased. None of them wanted to sleep in a filthy river. It was almost a surprise that the last leg of the journey was so uneventful, the only imposition that Raymond Cherton had to be carried by two of them at all times. He was, she noticed, much heavier than a man his size should be. Angharad was careful never to touch any of the two pale skin when it was her turn to bear the weight, afraid of what it might spread. By the time they reached the end of the high road, or at least the part they intended to use, its silhouette resumed half a mile ahead, leading into the mountains. Raymond was capable of hobbling forward. It only took one of them to help him keep up, much like Brasida. Getting down from the aqueduct was more tedious than dangerous. Raymond and Brasida were lowered tied with the rope instead of climbing down, which took most of the rest of their company to do safely, and after that down went their last supplies. They were all soaked, exhausted and irritable, but by the end of it they were finally back on solid ground. Around them were deep woods, tall trees whose branches obscured much of the sky, but the way forward was plain. They were near the bottom of a hill, and going north up the slope would lead them to the mountains, where the second trial awaited. They would be a need to march eastwards for a few hours, as the high road was on the western half of the Dominion, but they should be well past the hollows and the most dangerous lemures. They still set a watch after finding a tall tree to hide under, settling in for the night and hoping their clothes would dry some before they had to march again. Exhaustion saw to it that Angharad fell into a mercifully dreamless sleep. The clothes were only half dry, so they all stank like dogs when they set out the following morning. The slope was muddy and slippery, covered by a thick carpet of dead leaves, but there could be no mistaking the way they needed to go. Up the hills they went, through trees and great ferns and fields of pale blue wildflowers. When the mud turned to rock, Angharad knew they were close, and barely an hour after that they were looking up at the towering heights of the mountains at the heart of the Dominion of Lost Things. "We are a little further north than I would prefer," Song told them, consulting her map, but following the mountains east will get us most of the way there. We will have to go around crags to find the road to the sanctuary, but I expect we will reach the end of our journey a little past midday." The Tianxi's prediction ended up somewhat off, as they discovered 2 hours in that a landslide had cut their path east. They decided against risking to cross it when they found some great boulders balancing precariously further up, instead dipping back south into the woods and then resuming going east. Their pace was slower in the forest, noticeably so, and by the time they stopped for lunch they were barely halfway through the journey. Before long, at least, they finally found the crags that Song had mentioned, 3 massive rocks with flat tops, forming a broad half-circle appended to the mountainside. "The road we must take passes behind them," Song said, "and then rides the edge of the one closest to the mountains to lead up to the sanctuary's entrance. Would it not be possible to go through them instead?" Master Cosm asked. "Surely there are paths we could use." "There are, but I was advised against doing this," the Tianxi replied. "Landslides are apparently common, especially after rain. It is an unnecessary risk," Isabel opined. "Let us take the longer way." Most agreed with her, including Angharade. They had barely begun circling the crags when Brun breathed in sharply. He turned to catch her eye and she drifted close, but Remoncherden, now recovered, unlike poor Brasida who was still lagging behind despite being able to walk on her own, raised a hand at them. "None of that," the Infanzon said. "If your contract had told you something, share it with all our company and not only our dear Lady Tredegar." Angharade grimaced but nodded when Bruns turned a questioning gaze her way. The cat was out of the bag. Master Cosm had noticed a hint of a contract before their fight with the Hollows, and evidently passed on his suspicions to his lords. "There are people to our west," Brun said. "Hollows, I think. At least 10 of them. They had just come from the west, moving eastwards, so their company was either being followed or about to be. Most of them were poor woodsmen. Any half-decent tracker would be able to find traces of their passage." "Are they following us?" Augusto Cherden bluntly asked. "Too early to tell," Brun shrugged, "but they are coming our way." "Then we must hurry," Angharade said. "The last thing we need is a fight." She did not fear testing her blade against Darklings, but their company was wounded and exhausted. Mistakes were certain to be made. They picked up the pace, no longer even half-heartedly attempting not to leave a trail, and after half an hour Brun told them the Hollows had been left behind. The news cheered them all, until another quarter hour passed and he told them that another group of Hollows was coming from the west. They were, it seemed, being hunted. "If we head south we might be able to circle around the western warband," Isabel suggested. "That is exactly what they want, my lady," Cosmoflor shook his head. "They are not going for the kill at the moment, only pushing us further away from the sanctuary so they might hunt us at their leisure. We don't know how well they can track us," Remond noted. Isabel's idea might well be feasible. Angharade shook her head. "This is too much for coincidence," she said. "How would they have known to watch near the high road? It smacks of gloam sorcery or a tracking contract." The latter were not so rare. She had been hunted through the streets of Sacromonte by what she suspected to be exactly such a thing. The Darklings of the Dominion were a cult worshipping some ancient spirit. It was only to be expected that some among them would have won contracts off this red-eye. "She is right," Master Cosm grunted. "It's too close a hunt for how clever we have been. There is only one way, we need to try the crags." No one was eager, given the dangers Song had spoken of, but at least the landslides would not be purposefully hunting them. "I saw what looked like a trail going up," Brun told them. "About half a mile back." "I saw it as well," Song agreed. "It seems our best chance if we are to move quickly enough to slip the noose." It felt like wasted time to go back the way they'd just come, but Angharade kept silent. It was the wisest course. The trail the pair had spoken of was more a ravine just large enough for someone to squeeze through, leading towards what the lantern revealed to be an outcropping low enough to be climbable. For lack of better choices they went through, stones scraping at their sides. It was half an hour of occasionally painful squeezing and climbing. Brasida was finally feeling better, no longer slowing them down so much, until they reached a broader path. It was another ravine inside the crag, this one about 2 people wide. Angharad suspected it must have been worn into existence by rain over decades, for it was narrow at the top and wider at the bottom. The ground had dried since last night, fortunately, and the footing was smooth. The occasional falling rock was a small price to pay for the good time they made, but Good's news, as ever, were followed with bad. "We are being followed," Brun told them, voice echoing against the stone. "They are taking the same path we did." And gaining on them, he did not need to say. They hurried, but the hollows stayed on their heels and the situation was untenable. It was Augusto that offered a solution. "Look at the edges on either side," he said, pointing up. Rocks was what they found, but Angharad immediately grasped what he was leading at. The ravine, carved by water, was thinner at the top. The cliffside over them was being eaten away by erosion, grown unstable. With the right nudge, it could collapse. "We do not have enough powder to blow it up," Angharad told him. "Not even if they used every powder box and pouch they had with them." "No," Augusto agreed, "but there is another method at hand." He turned to Brysida, face stern, and the handmaid flinched. The Perduri wanted to chide the Infanzon for demanding such a thing of her when only yesterday she had saved all their lives, but she bit her tongue. It would work, she was sure of it. The ravine echoed slightly when they spoke. The oppressive noise that the redhead's contract made was certain to have great effect. And as she had said, they did not have enough powder to use instead. So instead Angharad steeled her heart and stepped forward. "If you are too sick to walk afterwards, Brysida, I will carry you myself." The other woman flinched again, and Angharad bit the inside of her cheek in shame. Isabel laid a hand on her handmaid's arm and gently smiled. "You know I would not ask it of you if our lives were not on the line, my dear," the Infanzona said. "But they are, yours among them." Brysida reluctantly nodded, then turned to address Angharad. "I will surely have need of your aid, my lady, so I must take you at your word," she said. "As it should be," the Perduri simply replied. They waited longer before doing it, choosing a fitting place for the deed. Further ahead they found a place where the ravine narrowed to a single man's width and the slope rose quickly ahead, which was most suitable. Angharad was tense all throughout, but after Brysida clapped her hands only a few chunks of stone fell over their heads, and their group scattered in time. The redhead had directed the sound skillfully, and past them the damage was impressive. After the initial avalanche, a heartbeat passed and there was a massive crack. An entire chunk of the cliff began sliding down, a stone larger than 2 horses, while all along the ravine smaller rocks fell in a thundering rain. Brysida bit through another tablet of chalk and was noisily sick afterwards, barely able to stand, so Angharad had her climb on her back and hold tight. They did not wait until the dust had settled to begin their flight. It was another hour of narrow ravines and waterless waterfalls before they found a way out, which to their pleasant surprise was atop the middle crag of the 3. They rose to the stars above their heads and a spread of thin grass atop the stone was beginning ahead. That stripe of forest seemed to lead all the way to where the first crag touched the mountains, from what they could make out. Their song said that the road to the sanctuary and the shrines began. Though it had been a dangerous affair, in the end they had shaven a few hours off their journey by risking the crags. The mood lifted at the news, even Brysida managing a smile, and they resumed their march. When they were a dozen feet away from the forest's edge, Brun suddenly went still. Angharad was learning to hate the sight of that. "Hollows," he said. "Dozens of them, waiting in ambush." Master Kozm loudly cursed. Angharad wished manners allowed her to do the same, for she fully shared the sentiment. The cult of the Red Eye had been one step ahead of them again. "How far ahead?" Sung asked. "Hard to tell," Brun admitted. "There's something off about the war band, like it is not truly there. I think the glow might be clouding my contract. So it could be false, an illusion?" Augusto cheered and pressed. "Wishful thinking," Angharad cut in. "We must treat them as real." The ensuing argument was quiet but heated, their company eventually owning up to the truth that there was no way out but through. Going eastwards on the other crag had no guarantee to yield a path down, and even if it did there was no guarantee the hollows would not follow them there, or even wait at the end of the path, at the bottom of the climb towards Sanctuary. The trouble was that not all of their group was fit to fight, or even run for long, so a ruse need be employed. One group to draw attention, another to sneak through, Master Cosm suggested. It was a plain strategy, but they were not well-oiled enough a crew to attempt anything complicated anyhow. Simply putting all the fighters in the distraction group was a recipe for slaughter if the other group was caught, so the division was not so clean. Isabel, Brasida, helped to walk by Beatrice, Sung and Augusto would be the crewmen to sneak around. Cosm, Angharade, Brun and Raymond were to draw the enemy into a running fight. With Brun's contract they should have the advantage of surprise, allowing them to strike first and through before running past the enemy. The ensuing chase and confusion would allow the others to get past the enemy, or such was the hope. Much as Angharade might have wished otherwise, there was no time for long goodbyes. The longer they waited to move the greater the risk the ambushing cultists would tire of waiting and try to catch them out in the open instead. She squeezed Isabel's hands tenderly when the Infanzone came to kiss her cheeks, then shook Sung's hand. The last three received a nod, friendlier for some than others, and she set out into the woods behind Master Cosm. With Brun serving as their eyes, they chose their angle of approach, along the eastern ridge of the crag, flanking the hollows, and slowly advanced, careful not to make any noise. For nearly half an hour they moved as silently as they could, nerves rising, until they were in place. Angharade could see most of the war band from behind the bush she used a hiding place, maybe 20 darklings mostly bearing spears and swords. There were a pair of crossbowmen as well, standing near an old hollow in robes. A priest of some kind. The old one, who the others seemed to defer to, was talking to people who she could not see. The sight was blocked by a fallen tree, in what sounded like Antigua. The cultists wore padded cloth as armor, save for a few elites, but were all fighting fit and many scarred from war. Careful with the crossbowmen, Cosm murmured. Try to keep trees in the way and kill warriors wearing padding first. The armored will tire first when chasing. They shared nods, fists tightening around their weapons, and took the deep breath before the plunge. Then the sleeping god turned in his slumber, undoing all their plans. It happened in moments. A band of half a dozen warriors, most armored with breastplates or mail, were talking with someone up a tree, and the answer they got had them laughing. They spread out, slapping or jostling a few of the other warriors, and in moments they were all up, heading southwest, where the other group should be beginning to move. Cosm swallowed a curse and they all hesitated. Their only chance against such numbers had been surprise, but now the warriors were up on alert. It would be a slaughter and not one in their favor. Yet they could not abandon the others, Angharade would not allow it. We hit them from behind when they begin to attack, she murmured. Augusto nodded in approval, then Cosm. Brun grimaced then agreed as well. They set out, slowly, and that was when Angharade saw her, that asphodel noble from the Blue Belt, the one with the acne scars. She had just leapt down from the tree, joining another. One by one Angharade saw them. Leander Galatas, still without his arm but no longer looking so gaunt. The large Aztlan called Ocatlan, his hammer hefted over his shoulder. And last of all the leader of their pack of jackals, Tupac himself. He asked something of the asphodline woman, Lady Acanthe, and she pointed to the southwest. The hollows followed her directions without a single voice speaking otherwise. Tracker, Angharade said through gritted teeth. But one who could not find their group. Their enemies would pay for that. Creeping behind the war band, who were so certain of the asphodline's contract did not bother with a proper rear guard, they waited until they could see the hollows spreading out for an ambush. When Sung carefully slipped out from behind the shadow of a tree, eyes scanning the woods, the warriors at the fore raised their spears, and finally Master Cosm signaled for their group to attack. They burst out of the brush, none of them announcing their arrival with war cries, and just as Sung's eyes widened at the sight of them, Cosm Floor shot the first hollow from behind. Madness seized them all. Angharade felt a crossbow bolt whiz past her head as she hewed open a man's head, slapping aside another's spear and plunging her blade through his open mouth. She ripped it clear, teeth flying, and saw that powder smoke was obscuring the melee. She glimpsed O'Cutlan kicking down Raymond Cherden, only to be driven back by Cosm, and then through the drifting smoke she saw Song being surrounded by hollows. Angharad rushed there, ducking under someone's blind strike in the smoke and cutting at what felt like cloth. Song was cornered, having cut a hollow with her blade, but now being stuck holding back another's blade, so Angharad struck with worried fury. They were fighters, these Darklings, but their training was lacking. She let the first overcome it to her lunge, tripped her as she stepped back and slit her throat on the way down. The hollow behind her screamed, attacking in rage with a two-handed sword, but he was slow. Strength only mattered if it could reach you. She plunged the point of her saber in his throat, wrenching it out and stepping to the side so he might die, finishing the strike at air. The third hit Song's knee, forcing her down with a pained grunt as the sword she was holding back dipped towards her throat, so Angharad clicked her tongue and pivoted to adjust her angle to eviscerate the fourth hollow. The Silverite Tianxi let out a snarl of triumph, pushing up and punching the last hollow in the throat before running him through. Angharad began to check her for wounds, then had to duck behind a tree when she heard the whistle of an arrow. Song followed her there. "We need to run," the Tianxi said. "Grab everyone we can and flee." Angharad nodded. "Brasida first," she said. "She will need help." Song nodded and the two burst from cover, Angharad avoiding the spear point of some fat Darkling in mail and kicking him in the stomach. Brasida was only a dozen feet away from them and she had been struck down, but she was not dead. Instead, a hollow had blackened her eyes and was now standing over her half-conscious form. "They want prisoners," Angharad realized with horror. She fell upon the hollow that stood over the red-headed maid, but before she could do more than bat aside his sword she heard movement behind her. She smoothly pivoted and struck at torso height, but Tupac tipped the blow with the side of his metal-segmented spear. He then whipped at her belly with the bottom of the haft, forcing her to backpedal. Behind them Song clashed blades with the hollow, covering Angharad's back. The Aztlan, she realized, was humming some kind of song. Something light and cheerful, as if this were a festival instead of a battlefield. "You will die for this," Angharad swore. "I admire your confidence," Tupac told her. Worse, he sounded like he meant it. She went after him furiously, but he was not like the cultist. Whoever had trained him, they had done a good work of it. He never stopped moving, forcing her to circle and weave by constantly changing the distance. He used his spear as much as a quarterstaff as thrusting weapon. Song finished her opponent and woke Brasida, but the redhead could barely move even when helped up. Worse, they'd drawn attention. More were coming, and when a crossbow bolt hit the tree an inch away from her head, Song drew back. "Run," the Tianxi said. "The others are, it is lost," Angharad snarled, catching a blow from the side of Tupac's spear and then using her favorite flatfoot trick, half a step back, let it slide down the length and pivot as you hit out with the pommel. Her saber's pommel caught the Aztlan in the jaw, her first solid hit, and he rocked back. Bloodied, at last. The Perduri moved towards Brasida, but there was already a cultist on the redhead, grabbing her by the hair, and she was tossed down on the floor. Angharad struck at the man's back furiously, but it was not enough. "No," Redhead wept. "No, you won't take me." The world breathed in, and then Brasida let out a scream like the clap of thunder. Ringing silence filled her ears, and something blew Angharad off her feet. She fell against a tree, knocking her shoulder badly. Her vision swam as she gasped, trying to rise, only to feel someone dragging her up. Sound began to return, but dimmed. "Quick," Isabel hissed. "Hurry, while they are confused." Angharad stumbled forward as best she could, half blind. Two hands steadied her, Isabel on one side and Master Cosm the other. But they were not alone. Raymond was with them, face bruised and lips bloodied. Behind them shouts began, the hollows beginning to recover from Brasida's scream. "The others," Angharad mumbled. "They ran also," Raymond said. "The hollows did not come to kill, they wanted sacrificed, and only took one." The pride in his voice sickened her. "Brasida, Oh sleeping god! She was still alive, and now the cultists had her. But what could Angharad do, save continuing to run? The days was passing, but she was no match for the war band now pursuing them. All she could do was run like a coward with the rest of their company. Only it could not be so easy. How long they ran in the dark Angharad was not sure, but eventually they stopped. The rest were ahead of them, hiding behind a tall stone, and Sung gestured fervently for them to stop. Angharad fell against a tree, hearing Master Kozm peek around and breathe in sharply. "There's a clearing ahead," he said. "And a pair of watchers. If we don't kill them before they scream for the others, we are all dead." "Where are we?" Angharad murmured. "Near the edge of the crag," Isabel replied just as quietly. "If we get past them, running northeast will be a straight line to the sanctuary road. We need only—" She was interrupted by a shout behind them. The Perduri tensed for half a heartbeat before realizing they had not been seen. Not yet. But the cultists they had left behind had found their trail, were catching up to them. If they did not move soon, then they were just as dead as in Kozm's prediction. "We'll have to shoot them," Angharad said. "All we can do is run." "Agreed," Master Kozm grunted, though he did not sound happy about it. Neither was she. The sound would draw the other cultists to them. The older man was already pouring powder down his pistol's muzzle, peeking out past the tree trunk to gauge the distance to the pair of watchers. The best shot of their company was Song, so Angharad half rose to try and catch her attention. Between she and Kozm, their odds were good of killing both watchers in one volley. Only when Angharad turned her gaze there, it was another who had a gun in hand. Augusto, his sole good arm steady and his face cold, aimed his pistol. Only it was not at the hollows. Behind him Braun turned, surprise on his face, but he was too late. Augusto Cherton met Angharad's eyes and pulled the trigger.